Good morning. I'm a social psychologist. I work for a multidisciplinary department of the University of Padua, and I work in the applied psychology unit. So I will give you the psychological view because that's my specialty. Because I will give you a psychological view to my presentation, the title is Contemplative Practices in the West, Ethics and Spirituality. But I will start by talking about contemplative psychology, which is a rather recent discipline. Now we have several studies and some theoretical papers, but when the title was introduced, it was totally new. And as you can see, it's pretty young, less than 40 years old. In 1986, De Witt coined the term contemplative psychology, saying that it was a discipline relating to the insights and the psychological methods that are often inherently present in the vision and practice and clarify and guide the contemplative development or religious development of a person. So according to De Witt, this is not a scientific subject matter. It's rather the subjective experience of the practitioner. So all the psychological aspects that arise in the mind of the practitioner, they often implicitly, sometimes you don't even realize that, but they clarify and guide the contemplative and religious development of a person. So the key point is practice, and it's typically a religious or spiritual practice. Of course, there is a lot to say in terms of distinctions and similarities between religion and spirituality, but we will discuss this later on. De Witt, back in 1986, De Witt already understood that there would be problems concerning his definition of contemplative psychology, because he observed that the growing secularization of our culture tends to deny the importance of contemplative discipline, and especially the religious and spiritual disciplines. And so De Witt, already in 1986, noted that scientific psychology was taking up the place that was left free due to the disappearance of contemplative psychology as he understood it. It was a good prophet because this is what happened in the following years, which is not necessarily bad. It's positive, actually, that scientific psychology started studying contemplative practices. But as we will see, this implied also ethical, including spiritual issues that we will see as applied to mindfulness, for the simple reason that mindfulness is the contemplative practice, and I need to underline this, that has been studied most in the Western scientific domain. The most recent theoretical review published this year on contemplative psychology gives a totally different definition. According to these authors, Van Gordon, Sapsiang, and Shonin, contemplative psychology deals with the psychological study of contemplative practices and processes. It's a bit tautological as a definition, but they also give examples of contemplative activities. And specifically, and this is all familiar to us, meditation, body and mind practices, including yoga and others, prayer, and devotional actions and acts. What happens here is that there is a scientist, a psychology here, who observes from the outside what happens in the practitioner. And maybe he or she asks what's happening, or through neuroimaging techniques, looks at what is happening in the brain of the practitioner. But in any case, is observation from the outside. It's not the subjective experience of the practitioner that is at the center of contemplative psychology. But the terms that we see here are still associated with a religious and spiritual aspect. But this is just an example of contemplative psychology. Other examples are education, and they talk about contemplative pedagogy, which is becoming more popular as a term also within schools, professional development, or reflexive practices that people put in place when thinking of their career and their work and general life context, in which one can think and reflect on the life purpose. So here we are in a totally lay domain where religion and spirituality may lack altogether. But according to the modern understanding of this discipline, we're still talking about contemplative practices, and we should keep it in mind, because sometimes they speak of contemplative science, and we may think it's referred to meditation and formal practice, but maybe they're talking about something totally different. And from a purely psychological viewpoint, according to these authors, also reflection, introspection, metacognition, self-regulation, self-awareness, and self-consciousness can be considered as examples of contemplative activities. For instance, psychotherapy, from this viewpoint, may very much look like a contemplative practice according to this definition. What these activities have in common, according to the authors, is the goal. The goal must be there, it must be clear. These are not extemporary activities, but they are long-term activities like eliciting insights, understanding of reality, or eliciting a meaning, growth, which could be personal, psychological, and also spiritual, and or well-being. I wrote and or because often what I said so far should lead to well-being according to the ideals of people who follow these practices, or well-being could be a result that you pursue regardless of everything else. Now, if this is the definition that is most comprehensive and partly or totally lay-based of contemplative practices, you have to admit that contemplative psychology has concentrated in the course of years mainly on practices and aspects that are typical of Buddhist tradition. So it's true that many activities can be defined as contemplative, but more than 90% of scientific studies that have been published so far deal with aspects that fall within the Buddhist tradition. And the authors identified three waves of studies. From the 1960 onwards, the first studies were published concerning meditation, yoga, mindfulness, and then cognitive aspects. So the main topic is awareness, mindfulness, with all the results that these may have, mainly on well-being. So the first wave of studies investigated the connection between awareness and well-being. Well-being understood in various manners, and this may be an issue, or rather an opportunity for reflection. It's interesting to note that the first wave was characterized by a mainly cognitive investigation, what in psychology we call cold processes, without the warmth of feelings and affection. And the distinction between mind and body is more mind-focused, although this definition is not really sound. But the topic here is mainly linked to cognitive aspects. And in the long term, this became non-satisfactory, because obviously contemplative practices, especially in the Buddhist tradition, has a very strong affective component. That's why in much more recent years, since 2005, several studies were published on social and emotional aspects of contemplative practices, including compassion and loving kindness. So we have studies on the effects of training on compassion and loving kind meditation, and they investigated whether this has effects in terms of well-being, sociality, empathy, the typical variables of psychology, but feature a non-cognitive component, or it's not just cognitive. It's interesting that in recent years, since 2013, studies were published on the perception of phenomena of the self and others, where the topics are more linked to wisdom. So these topics include emptiness and non-self, no self, impermanence, interdependence, interconnection. These are complex topics. Of course, we all know that emptiness is not a topic that you can take lightly, and it's hard to investigate the topic with people who do not have a Buddhist background. Typically, this translates in a perception of interconnection. So emptiness is more linked to interdependent origination. It's the perception of interconnection, interrelation between the self and others. It's interesting to note that over the years, starting from the conception of awareness, I didn't say it before, but it's very much ego-centered. You cultivate that for yourself. Then you go towards social issues, and here compassion becomes a topic, and the method becomes more important to then reach the topic of wisdom. We will now focus on mindfulness, as I anticipated, because this is an example of Western contemplative practice that exemplifies what happens when Western psychology deals with practices that have a historical, philosophical, religious, and spiritual tradition behind it. I think that all of you know the definition, the official definition of mindfulness, which was given by John Kabat-Zinn. Anyway, according to John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness is the awareness that arises in paying attention in a specific manner, intentionally, in the present moment, in a non-judging way. So that's awareness, the first category that we looked at. And an orientation towards experience linked to non-judgment, which is also the source of some misunderstanding. After Kabat-Zinn, many other authors discussed and wrote about mindfulness. There is an increasing number of publications that were published. So recently, some authors had to come together in an attempt to provide a general description of mindfulness that could apply to different study domains. More specifically, bishops and others, including Shapiro and other authors who published a lot on this topic, they defined mindfulness as comprised of two aspects. The first one is the self-regulation of attention, so as to keep it on the immediate experience, thus allowing to recognize mental events in the present moment, and then the adoption of a particular orientation towards your own experiences in the present moment, characterized by curiosity, opening, and acceptance. What is interesting is that this definition would actually bring to mind the meditation experience. The attitude we're observing, the self-regulation of attention should characterize the meditative practice, and they should be applied to what arises in the mind during meditation. So, for instance, the non-judgment that was also discussed by Kabat-Zinn, or opening and acceptance, according to Bishop, is linked to the fact that when a thought arises, especially if it is a disturbing thought during meditation, instead of engaging in a process of rumination, saying, look at myself, what am I thinking, what do I do? The attitude is non-judging, and you just say, this is what has arisen, I observe it, and then it disappears if I do not follow it. This definition is also often applied to daily life. So it is believed that it is possible to have a self-regulation of attention on the immediate experience with this opening, curiosity and acceptance, even when you walk on the street, when you speak with people, which is obviously very complicated. It might be more appropriate to underline that these aspects should be cultivated in the meditation practice, and once you're familiar with them, you can apply them to your daily life. Otherwise, it becomes a sort of orientation towards life that is theoretical and mental. If you have to make an effort every time to remind yourself that you have to be open and non-judging, whereas it should be an attitude that arises spontaneously once you have become familiar with it in meditation. I'm not criticizing these authors. Kabat-Zinn is perfectly aware of all these aspects. I'll rather focus on the fact that sometimes you misunderstand the traditional teachings, but also Kabat-Zinn's teachings, which is a bit worrying. As we know, Kabat-Zinn offered the MBSR, which is a group intervention program, but it's important to underline that it was initially intended to be used on patients with chronic pain. It was done in hospital with patients with chronic physical suffering, and the purpose was to alleviate and to soothe psychological suffering, with the idea that the physical disease had to be resolved medically. So Kabat-Zinn works in the medical field, in a medical context, but the psychological aspect, which is often an additional burden that people who suffer physically have with them, can be alleviated by practicing mindfulness. So this is the origin of mindfulness in the West, and we should remember that, because it was then applied to all possible other domains. What is shared with the participants and that they learn is to be less reactive and less judging on their experience, better capable of recognizing and interrupting disadaptive patterns of thoughts and behaviors. And so in 8 weeks, you get used, you familiarize with sitting meditation, but also with other practices. People discuss, they share, and in the end, you can obtain these results, which once again are aimed at reducing psychological suffering. What is interesting here, which Kabat-Zinn has explicitly underlined only recently, is that the term mindfulness should not be understood only to sati, which is done in all articles. They say mindfulness is the translation of the Pali word sati, which means memory or remembering, as if it were remembering the past, which is not true. If you will, it's what Alexander Berzin defined as mental glue, the fact that the mind remains attached to the object of meditation and remains there. This favors, of course, awareness and concentration, of course. So that's sati. Kabat-Zinn clarifies that when he used the term mindfulness, he didn't mean sati or not just sati. What he meant by that word was a much broader term intended to indicate a universal karma with no religious, historical, or philosophical connotation. Kabat-Zinn's goal, which is explained in a very important article published in 2011, so the goal was and still is to bring mindfulness to the whole society to, and I quote, alleviate suffering and catalyze more compassion and wisdom in our lives and our culture. So the goal was to attract meditation of Buddhist origin, so import meditation from a Buddhist tradition, abstract it and apply it to the Western world to help people coming from a Western tradition to solve specific issues, maybe contextualize, for instance, psychological suffering associated with physical pain to reduce stress, but more generally to bring compassion and wisdom in your life and in culture in general. And I think that everybody agrees on this topic, on this goal. What Kabat-Zinn wanted to do specifically was to make it all lay-based, to make it acceptable to everyone. Now, if we are here, is that because we probably have a propensity towards Buddhism, but many people don't and will never have it. And as soon as they hear about meditation or something that has a religious connotation, become mistrustful. So Kabat-Zinn wanted to bring the benefits of meditation to these people who would never come close to Dharma spontaneously, who would never participate in a meditation retreat in a meditation center. And he believed that these people would benefit from this mindfulness because John Kabat-Zinn was sure he would give them benefits. In a way, Kabat-Zinn already suggested that those who are interested in Buddhism can ignore Western mindfulness and they can devote themselves to classical Buddhist practices. But for those who are not interested in Buddhism, they may get benefits from mindfulness. The benefits of mindfulness have been studied scientifically increasingly more. I looked at the Web of Science, which is probably the most important database for scientific publications, and I looked at how many indexed articles were published with the word mindfulness in the title, so clearly devoted to this topic. As you can notice, there has been an exponential growth in the number of articles. In the 1980s, there were 6 articles by John Kabat-Zinn, of course, and maybe someone else, and then that increased to 12 in the following 5 years, and then 20 to 85. It's interesting because up until 2000 and something, you could be up to date on everything that was published on mindfulness, and the following years it became impossible. The number reached 400 and then 1,800 and then 8,000. I'm just talking about articles and papers published on indexed journals, indexed in the most selective database. And I'm not talking about books. So, of course, the number of studies is even bigger. Because mindfulness was initially associated with the topic of well-being and health, it's interesting to notice how many of these articles had well-being or health as a topic. And there is a good percentage of them. Initially, there were none, and that's interesting. But over the years, almost 1/3 or 1/4 of them had these terms in their contents. So it's obvious that the Western interest in mindfulness is linked to well-being. Out of curiosity, I also looked at how many articles had a spiritual connotation. Then I will have to clarify what I mean by spirituality. But just for the sake of it, I looked at how many articles had mindfulness in their title and something associated with spirituality in the topic. And the results are not really positive, because only a minority of them would fit into this category. Initially, almost all of them fit into the category, but that was easy. But over time, as you can see, we have more than 8,000 articles on mindfulness. So only 136 deal with spirituality, whereas 2,000 plus deal with well-being, which is indicative of the fact that mindfulness has become something connotated not by spirituality, but by other aspects. More specifically, these studies investigated the beneficial aspects of mindfulness in terms of well-being, health, and not not only that, I published meta-analysis, not individual articles, but articles on other articles. So as you can see, benefits on health or well-being or psychological health are very popular topics in this domain. There is something applied to specific topics, for instance, some substance abuse, and we start seeing articles on social aspects, but these are more recent and are quite interesting because we are going beyond the initial domain. Now, the whole development, in my opinion, raises 4 ethical questions, at least. The first is that the ethical basis of mindfulness and more generally of contemplative practices studied by Western science are not specified. In traditional meditation, ethic is a necessity, is a necessary requirement in the twofold noble way. Ethics is key. The first supreme teaching is focused on ethics, for instance, because we know that any contemplative practice, any Buddhist contemplative practice requires ethics. Without ethics, you go nowhere. So ethic in original practice is explicit and coded. In contemporary mindfulness, ethical topics are implicit. I mean, they may arise spontaneously, but very often they are not even mentioned, which is intentional, because Kabat-Zinn's intention was to bring this practice to lay people. And if you speak about Buddhist ethics, that's not for lay people. It's not a lay practice. So intentionally, there is no reference to virtues or non-virtuous actions or the issue of karma. This is left out. But of course, this implies some risks. A first risk that some people highlighted is that mindfulness could be used in organizations to exploit people. Ideally, a more mindful worker may produce more. This is beneficial to the company, maybe also for the worker who's more aware, but certainly is not in line with the original purposes of meditation. Or a discussion was started on violence. They talked about mindfulness, mindful snipers, the fact that awareness and mindfulness may help a sniper to be more accurate or a thief to be better at his work. So the idea is that even those who perform non-ethical activities may benefit from mindfulness, which was forbidden in the Buddhist tradition because you had to start from ethics. But if you take ethics out of the way, you can get directly to that result. Some authors still defended the application of mindfulness in these years, saying that even if you teach mindfulness to soldiers, at least the soldiers are more resistant, they feel better, they are less likely to develop PTSD, so there could be benefits. But of course, the underlying motivation for applying mindfulness in these domains might not be virtues. Another important point is the misunderstanding of the non-judging component, which is part of the original definition, because sometimes this is understood as suspending judgment. So, for instance, in an organization, they deliver mindfulness courses, and the order of the company is non-ethical, but I suspend my judgment, and so that's good. There are people who understand mindfulness this way. And there are those who maybe in good faith participate in courses on mindfulness, and they may think that non-judging is a sort of moral laxism, so everything is good. I don't judge, and this makes me mindful. Whereas the non-judging element is typical of meditation, where I do not judge my thoughts because they arose in that specific moment and I let them go, which doesn't mean not judging the fact that you may have violent thoughts, because of course you judge them. Judging meaning you try to remove them. So that's what guides the mind from affliction. You can liberate your mind from affliction. Kabat-Zinn clarifies this very precisely. But sometimes this non-judging attitude could be misunderstood. So as far as ethics is concerned, you have to exclusively rely to the motivation of the clients, the organizers, the teachers, and the participants' attitude, which is good, but risky in a way. There is an open debate on this and no solution. Of course, you have to be particularly careful with this aspect. In 2011, John Kabat-Zinn offered a solution, and so he proposed that mindfulness teachers should know perfectly well what the ethical principles are, and he said that if it's true that the teachings, what they teach, must be for lay people, but the teachers have to have a very deep knowledge of the Dharma, because this way they can sort of distill and infer universal aspects from the Dharma, but at the same time they can immediately understand whether there are ethical issues or issues relating to the motivation of the participants and of the client. So the trainer or teacher here becomes crucial. And Kabat-Zinn clarified that thinking of becoming good mindfulness teacher because you attended a course is absolutely inappropriate. You should have a deep, decade-long knowledge of the Dharma. You need to have participated in retreats and be very familiar with what you're translating for the lay people. The second ethical issue deals with the excessive emphasis on well-being. In light of the studies that I mentioned before, the conclusion was drawn that mindfulness leads invariably and over time to well-being. Some define Buddhism as a science of happiness. This could be problematic for different reasons. First of all, because those are committed to the practice may have unrealistic expectations and hence an attachment to the desired benefits and an aversion for the fact that they fail to reach them. And of course, in 8 weeks, you cannot reach those targets, and you should be clear on that from the very beginning. So developing attachment and aversion adds on to ignorance. So you need to be very careful in terms of what you promise. The very definition, science of fiction, science of happiness, is risky in this respect. This also leads to ignoring the problems that come to surface when you're committed to meditating. I mean, if you ever tried to meditate, you certainly know that your colleagues are subject to that distraction, backache. That's normal, because classical texts also explain that, and they also explain the antidotes to that. In modern mindfulness teachings, they suggest that well-being is around the corner, and you expect not to encounter any problem. And this may actually generate disappointment and abandonment of the practice, which is a shame, because it means that if that person had an interest, maybe he or she had a sort of karmic propensity or, tended to appreciate the practice. And maybe because he or she was put in suboptimal conditions, he develops aversion and drops out. So these are serious risks. In this respect, I need to also underline that hedonistic well-being, which is often offered as the final goal of the practice. Happiness, well-being, feeling good, not having negative emotions, no stress. This is more hedonistic in nature, linked to immediate pleasure. According to Buddhism, as we all know, this corresponds to a subtle form of suffering. And so it's the suffering of change. And then it's an integral part of samsara. Ricard discussed this in an article that he wrote for a psychological journal, and he underlined the fact that very often these expectations are not only unrealistic, but also wrong. The practice is not for hedonistic well-being. If anything, is for a demonic well-being that takes time and development, but I will not get into this topic. The publishing and marketing domains played a role in all this. This is a manual which is quite popular in the United States. The title is Mindfulness, a practical guide to finding peace in a frantic world. So in a frantic world, you try to find peace through mindfulness. And that's okay. But the other one, life-changing bestseller, is a bit tricky. It sort of implies that that book will allow me to change my life. Well, maybe, but not necessarily so. And then it says if you want to get rid of anxiety and if you want well-being, then this book is for you. It's a bit too much. We talked about the Four Noble Truths. Well, getting rid of anxiety and stress is part of the Buddhist teaching, but getting rid of suffering in a broader sense, and for sure, reading that book will not be enough. But if you buy that book after reading these sentences on the cover, you expect those results. And of course, you're bound to be disappointed. In Italy, we've got the very best. So the Italian translation is this one, same book, and besides the model in ecstatic meditation, we have as a title, Mindfulness Method, 56 days from happiness. 50 days practice for happiness, the book that liberated millions of people from anxiety and stress. I don't need to comment this Italian interpretation of the title. The manual is very well written, but then it has been used for the purposes of marketing. And that's the way mindfulness is often interpreted and proposed. The third ethical issue is closely related to the previous one. I mentioned marketing, and here we have the risk that mindfulness is instrumental to the neoliberalist and consumeristic logic. It can be considered as a product, an individual practice where you can put in more or less commitment and partly reach your expected results. Now, in this respect, the fact of not being happy becomes your own personal responsibility, because if you have the method for you to be happy and happy in 56 days, if you fail, it's your fault. So I am the problem. That's the thinking. And this releases society, culture, your employer, politicians from any responsibility. So you totally neglect issues such as social justice, welfare, solidarity, and also ethical conduct. The only thing that matters is being aware. If you're aware, you're happy. And if you're not happy in 56 days, the fault is yours. And so you have to start thinking that you have some problem. So in the end, not only don't you get the promised well-being, you get depressed, because you feel worse than before. This is what is called rebound effect. You try to do something to get better, and then you get worse. Once again, I'm not criticizing the serious mindfulness by Kabat-Zinn, because he was perfectly aware of all this, and he still is. But the the direction that this practice took in some contexts led to these results. And finally, mindfulness may become one of the many products that promises well-being and social approval. Well, Niels coined the term "make mindfulness," which is self-explanatory. So it's one of the many products available on the shelves of the self-help products. It's realistic. If mindfulness doesn't work, since the shelves are well stocked, you can pick something else. And maybe you start practicing crystal therapy, just to name one, because you pick whatever promises well-being without discriminating on the deepest potential qualities of these offerings. This is a picture that I took personally in a library in the city center of Padua. I don't know if you can see it, but here you have the mindfulness section, and then you have career money. Underneath, you have NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and this is personal development, which is somehow related. This is to say that a reader who's faced with this display may be misled. Well, I'm not saying that the library is wrong, because they use marketing as well, but it's, strange that mindfulness is here, whereas the section with Dharma text is a bit far away. The fourth and last point regarding ethics, which is the most important one, is decontextualization. So mindfulness has been extrapolated from its original religious context to make it available to anyone in a totally lay form. And this was made intentionally and also for good reasons. But there are risks, of course. One was highlighted by Thupten Jinpa, according to whom the main risk of this operation is to reduce Buddhism to meditation only, which is a great reduction, and meditation to mindfulness only, losing sight of the complexity and depth of the original teachings. So all the path of practices and studies that is based on meditation and introspection is totally ignored, and only this individual aspect is taken into consideration. And by isolating it, you deprive mindfulness of its spiritual connotations. So mindfulness risks being included in a materialistic utilitarian logic. It becomes a technique to strengthen your mental ability and your mental abilities and attention and concentration, thereby transforming it into a mere means to obtain mundane benefits. So spiritual connotations opens up a new perspective. We've talked about ethics so far. From the viewpoint of spirituality, maybe we have to come to a common understanding in terms of what are we really talking about. I think we should make a reflection on the view of Western science, which is clearly and unquestionably characterized by a materialistic vision. I think everybody agrees on that. So you cannot hold Western science liable of the fact that this materialistic vision is followed in contemplative practices, because it's part and parcel of the very nature of science. And the same definition of spirituality that we find in psychology and in science in general is problematic, because, for instance, one of the latest definitions that summarizes other definition given in the literature is the following: spirituality is the search and experience of a connection with yourself, with others, and with nature, and with the transcendent. Where these parts are not present at the same time, you may just have the first, or the second, or the third, or the fourth. So it's probably the transcendent aspect that could be understood to be spirituality, in the sense that there is something spiritual which is not material, which I took for granted in terms of giving a definition of spirituality. But this is a sub-definition because they speak of connection. So being connected to your inner world, being deeply connected with the others, maybe being empathic, all of which is positive, being connected with nature. Ecologism is a hot topic nowadays for all of us. Each of these aspects, according to Western authors, can provide a spiritual vision where spirituality to them means going beyond the immediate. Well, not just to them, spirituality means going beyond what is immediately there. Now, you may wonder to what extent this is in line with the vision of the Buddhist world. We're talking about a practice that had been extrapolated from the Buddhist tradition. It's true that there are several different traditions, but the mind as non-material is something that all traditions share. So the idea that there is a mind which is connected with the body but is not the body is central and key. Also because without the mind, you don't have rebirth or karma or anything else. None of these aspects make sense without this central element. And so we're in a domain that cannot be reconciled. So we cannot claim, we cannot expect that Western science develops looking at the spiritual aspects. It cannot do it because it's materialistic. So the point is, to what extent is it possible for Western science to understand Buddhism and its practices in depth? Perhaps what Western science has done is that it studied what it could do, namely well-being, also social well-being maybe, or connection with others, with nature, with yourself, which are important aspects. But clearly, this is a limited vision of what is a true spiritual practice. This leads to my conclusion, i.e., is an integration really possible, an integration between Western science, Western psychology, and Buddhism in general? I tried to provide a positive answer to this question. In order to give a positive answer, however, you have to start from a common ground and clarify that this is the only common ground that you can rely on, because the rest raises issues. A common ground which is known in Western societies, and not just there, in human culture, I would say, is known that all individuals look for well-being. Buddhism would say all sentient beings, but maybe we will not talk about non-human beings, but in general, all human beings look for well-being, of course, at different levels. So well-being deriving from relaxing before the TV after a long working day cannot be comparable to final well-being of nirvana, enlightenment. Those two worlds will never get together. So well-being on different levels, but at least this is the common ground. What is interesting is that Western psychology has discovered that in the search for well-being, some mental processes, emotions, thoughts, concepts of self can be disadaptive, whereas others are adaptive. So thinking in a certain manner with certain emotions may lead to well-being, whereas having different thoughts and self-thoughts may not lead to well-being and rather take you to, disease or uneasiness. Shapiro and Adam Wallace clarified this aspect. From a scientific lay perspective, they clarified that some behaviors and thoughts lead to well-being and others don't. From this viewpoint, the Dharma also explains why something is adaptive or not adaptive. In the tradition, they don't use the word adaptive, but virtues, and disadaptive would be non-virtues. What is virtues or adaptive is what reflects reality in inverted commas. Ultimate reality, wisdom leads to well-being or happiness, the ultimate happiness, eliminating ignorance. If you eliminate ignorance, you eliminate samsara at the root. It is possible that also from a Western viewpoint, compassion, wisdom, which is important for contemplative wisdom, may allow people to come close to an inner, exterior, and social reality, taking a distance from illusions, illusion of autonomy, the fact of being able to live by yourself without others, individual success as being a positive value to aim at. These are all illusions. And the lay practice of awareness, for instance, or compassion and wisdom that we have not discussed because we just discussed mindfulness, the practice of these three pillars may allow people to come closer to this. If you realize interdependence, you take a big step forward. So if you can come closer to reality, that may help the person to distinguish between thoughts, between adaptive and disadaptive thoughts and actions, which are not virtues or non-virtues, because we are in the lay domain. But this discrimination may allow people to make an aware choice, which in our language is discriminating wisdom, being able to discriminate what is beneficial and what is not. I'd like to underline that also mindfulness, understood in the most comprehensive manner and closer to Kabat-Zinn view, albeit lay, may allow people to come closer to reality, and at that point, those people could take the steps that would lead them to choose between adaptive or non-adaptive actions and thoughts, choosing for the former. So this choice becomes feasible and it becomes available at any time. So being present, being aware, being mindful, and in the present moment may still give people the opportunity to understand that we are always faced with choices, and these choices can lead us to something adaptive or something disadaptive, one way or the other. And having some experience with contemplative practices, albeit lay practices, may favor or facilitate the awareness of this potential choice. And this may lead to individual personal growth, and not just well-being in 56 days, but something that may really change people's lives, not just from an individual viewpoint, but also from a social viewpoint, because, of course, our choices have an impact on other people and on the environment. So I like to think that with these premises, an integration between the two worlds is still possible, albeit considering all the risks that I discussed before. Thank you very much.